internationally for the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, New Yorker, Guardian, Harper's, Vice, Washington Post, and more. Tonight, we will also hear from poet Connie Roberts and musician, activist, and touring and recording artist Jess Kavanagh, who will each share artistic of these systems. And we're honored to welcome Ailbhe Smyth, who joins Caelainn in conversation. Ailbhe is a longtime social activist, has published widely on feminism, politics, and culture, and was named as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in 2019 for her work in repealing the Eighth Amendment, one of many campaigns in which she played a leadership role in Ireland. There will be a chance for questions at the end of the talk, and you can submit them through the chat. Please also check the chat for links to purchase Republic of Shame. Now I will turn it over to Ailbhe and Caelainn, and welcome to both of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. It's really exciting to be here with you virtually in the Irish Arts Centre, and also lovely to be meeting up again in Dublin, Caelainn, with yourself. I think your book, Republic of Shame, is a really, as Rachel said, a very important book. It's also really quite brilliant in its way, because it is obviously a very harrowing it's a very harrowing book, because it's a story of cruelty, of broken lives, and of the people who set out to break those lives, who were indifferent to human suffering. And I think above all, it is a huge indictment of a society which allowed this degree of misogyny to carry on as we looked on for decades and decades and decades. And of course, the sheer scale of it is very, very shocking. I can't get out of my killer moment when a baby was delivered to an orphanage in Dublin, in Temple Hill, and heaven knows what had happened to his mother. And the baby's name and date of birth were scrawled in red ink on the baby's back. I mean, it just sort of defies understanding. And I think what really fascinates me, that there's a couple of generations between yourself and myself, and I'm wondering what drew a young woman like yourself to really do the meticulous research and the very difficult work of unearthing these stories.
It's thanks, Ailbhe. It's so good to be with you tonight, and thanks to the Irish Arts Centre. It's interesting, the story in particular. That institution was actually around the corner from the house where I grew up in Dublin, in Blackrock. And I had walked past it growing up on the way to school and never really knew what it was. My father grew up in the area. He didn't know what it was. People sort of just knew that the nuns lived there. And as soon as I began researching and reporting on this book and speaking with survivors, I realized that this was an institution where thousands of children had been adopted from, including to the US, sent to the US on planes, adopted by American families, significant donations given to the religious orders. This institution was a place where many illegal adoptions happened from. And actually, friends of mine and people I knew had been separated from their children through this very institution. So it was of realizing how literally close to home these religious run institutions were, and how people my own age, people I knew, were affected. And so I started reporting this in 2017. I'd actually been in New York for several years beforehand, and was then reporting around the world. I was in Nigeria, I was in South Africa, and I was back in Ireland in 2017. And that was just a really significant year. It was the year that the test excavation at Tuam, where it was discovered that died, and the remains of children were found in sewage chambers on the grounds of this mother and baby home, this institution run by the Bon Secours nuns, which actually launched a statutory investigation into this system of institutions. The results of that test excavation were released that year. And so it was confirmed that there were human remains on this site, buried in that shocking, undignified way, very dehumanizing. But that year was also significant because it was a few years after the marriage equality referendum, when there was this landslide vote in favor of equality, and also this very difficult conversation about who gets to be a family had been raised during that. You know, some people in the church had raised this issue of, you know, it has to be, you know, a mother and a father, and the nuclear family is the only acceptable form. And there was a real backlash to that. I think it brought up a lot of pain of sort of generations and decades of people being told who got to be a family and who, you know, had the right to be and who had the protections of a family. And many unmarried mothers, as they were called at the time, that terrible term, were told that they could not be mothers, that they would be selfish to keep their children in these institutions. We were also looking ahead to the repeal referendum on abortion, which you were, you know, such a huge part of and helped to lead that change in this country. And so a lot of silences were being broken about how church and state had treated pregnant people, had treated women and their children. And so this was sort of all happening at the same time. And there was a very important sort of, you know, opening of you know, minds and hearts to these stories. And people were suddenly feeling that they could trust each other to speak about what had happened to them and to speak about their experiences. So it was a moment of real change and a very interesting time then to be reporting on this. And it came up often in conversations. So I began just talking with survivors and speaking with people within the religious orders as well who had ran these institutions, trying to understand how they were normalized for so long.
Can I just ask you there, just stop you for a moment, because it would be great to hear a bit more about that interviewing process. But I mean, you speak about this whole network of institutions that were, by and large, I think almost 100% run by religious orders in Ireland, so that you had the mother and baby homes, so-called mother and baby homes. I mean, anything less cozy than the name indicates is hard to imagine. But the mother and baby homes, you had the Magdalene laundries, where women, when they had been obliged to give up their babies, were sent to work in the laundries. You had the orphanages for the children. There were industrial schools which looked after young, where young people were often sent when they were difficult to manage, and so on and so forth. And I mean, you refer to this as the shame industrial complex. And you say that at one point in the book that obviously Ireland didn't invent these kinds of institutions or this sort of shame industrial complex, but you add in a phrase that remained with me, that it did bring this to a sort of dark perfection, that it was particularly pronounced and dark and difficult in Ireland. And I was wondering if you would comment a little bit about why you think that was, or where did that terrible shame come from? Because the book, it's redolent with this terrible shame that people felt and the punishment that were meted out to them.
Yeah, I mean, the first mother and baby home, one of the first, was set up in Britain, and this system was sort of brought over in many ways by the religious order that set up that institution. Similar institutions operated in the US as well. In New York, there were adoption agencies and religious-run institutions where women were sent. I actually went to one in San Francisco run by the Daughters of Charity, who have their provincial house, again, across the road from where I grew up, and operated the largest mother and baby institution in Ireland. So it wasn't only Ireland, but I think this system of institutions operated for far longer in Ireland. You know, I found through reporting that there was a mother and baby home institution operating until 2006 in Ireland. And, you know, I was around 17 at that time. So that was just shocking to me. So, and the Magdalene laundries didn't close till the 1990s. Women were being incarcerated in these institutions, you know, up until the 90s and even beyond. I think that the duration of it was significant. And I think it's a combination. Ireland was a new state when many of these institutions opened. We were very poor, and it was, the government basically abdicated responsibility and handed over control of this system to the religious orders.
Yes.
De Valera wanted our constitution to be approved by the Pope. There was this idea of an ideal Irish nation where, women were comely maidens who stayed at home. And, this idea of a very pure religious morality became really intrinsic to Irish national identity. And so anyone who challenged that or threatened that sort of needed to be hidden away. And that is the purpose that these institutions served. Women sent to the mother and baby home institutions were called offenders by church and state. Mm-hmm. It's written down in black and white in their records that they were called offenders. So they were criminalized. And when they were sent to these places, even while pregnant, they were forced to work. And then forced to remain in these places for several years, working unpaid for the nuns, separated from their children, forced to look after the children of other women who had been separated from their babies. And many people went through several of these institutions and spent their whole life in an institutional system. And that's why I think calling it the shame industrial complex, it was this network of institutions. There were people born in mother and baby homes who grew up in industrial schools, left at 16 with no education about sex or their own bodies, became pregnant and were sent back to mother and baby homes, and then maybe to the Magdalen laundry for the rest of their lives, institutionalized for the rest of their lives.
So those women who were known as you say, as offenders and who were called fallen women, although it was never made clear that in every case where there was a pregnancy, somebody had pushed them, that is the man, because the men are really absent from the story. And again, we might come to that, but I did want to ask you about, we tend always to blame the church, the Catholic Church in particular, for what happened in these terrible places. And I don't think we're altogether wrong, except that, of course, the Irish state colluded. As you quite rightly say, the state abdicated its responsibility and actually paid money to these institutions to supposedly look after, take care, but there was no care taken. But where these people could be sequestered and sent away, and where they were made to expunge their sin or their offence very often for the rest of their lives. But isn't there a sense, and some of your interviewees do refer to this, that it wasn't just the church and the state, that the whole society colluded with this mechanism? I'm thinking of Noelle Brown, who has been such an activist and a campaigner herself around the issue of adoption, because she was adopted, who said everyone knew about this. People, she said, I used to get very angry when people would say, oh, but I never knew anything about this. And I think that sums up a whole attitude. So, I mean, is there a sense in which it was really a whole society colluding in these brutal acts?
I think that question of knowing and not knowing is so interesting, and Noelle speaks so eloquently about it, and she speaks of it as an equality issue, and that we will never have real equality in Ireland until we face this legacy. I think that, it's hard, I think, for people in my generation to understand the authority that the church had in Ireland throughout these years, over the state and over everyday people. The local priest would, have the authority to approve you for a job or not. He might read you for the pulpit if you did something wrong. There was a fear of questioning the church. I talked to a policeman, a guard in my local area, who remembers being terrified of questioning the nuns or the local priest. They were the ultimate authority. So I think, it was just this ultimate authority in Ireland. And I think yes, people knew. And it's very interesting when you look at the later years, you know, particularly in the 80s, while, you know, when social work started to become sort of professionalized, and you had social workers working in these institutions run by nuns, and it was very normalized. They had a national conference on the unmarried mother in the 1970s.
Yes.
And so it was just accepted that the religious orders ran these institutions and women were sent there. The degree to which I think some people knew the level of punishment and trauma that women were going through and beyond these walls, I think, you know, maybe not everyone knew. And then also, I think people often ask me, what about the families? And many families did send their daughters away, did disown their daughters, but many also never knew. You know, there were several women I talked to who never spoke about it to their family, who went away, who were sent away in secret by social workers, by doctors, by the local priest, never told their mother, never told their father, and kept that secret most of their lives. So, you know, families sometimes didn't know that their own children had been sent to these institutions. And something that was really heartbreaking was, you know, in the 90s, as these silences started to be broken, and that unquestionable authority of the church, you know, because of the abuse scandals, you know, the horrific abuse that happened in this system of institutions started to be revealed or faced. You know, it was sort of known about, but it started to be finally faced. I think people started talking to each other, and some of these mothers, you know, said to their parents, you know, I was sent to one of those institutions. And one woman, her mother turned around and said, well, so was your aunt, you know, and if we had known, we never would have sent you away. But the fear of stigma and the fear of discrimination was so strong that people didn't trust their own parents, they didn't trust their own neighbors. Parents were told by the local priest or by nuns working as social workers that the best thing they could do is send their children away to these institutions because they would be discriminated against in the local hospital or, you know, maternity ward. So there was definitely a collusion between those in power, between the state, the church, and a professional class, you know, of lawyers, doctors, and social workers, and
It is
also
quite
middle class
remarkable.
Catholic family.
Exactly, exactly. And it is quite remarkable how few people spoke up. I mean, I'm very struck by the fact that Dr. James Deany, who ultimately closed down one of the homes or had it closed down, I think he managed to close down Vespera. He was is one of the very, very few medical professionals who spoke out against these homes, which they were inspecting. So I think you're rather kind to the society as a whole. I think people knew a lot more. They knew inside themselves, probably, I think, a lot more. There is one thing more I just wanted you to say, perhaps something about before we hear Connie Roberts' wonderful poem. We talk a lot about, and quite rightly, about sexual consent at the moment. And I hope that we go on talking about it, and I hope it becomes a reality in the lives of young women and girls much more than it is. But I'm very struck here that the women always, they never got to leave the home with their baby, basically. They had to give the baby up in most cases. And the nuns said it was always with their consent, but it was no such thing.
No, I think this question of consent, and it's something, you know, with the statutory investigation that's due to report, the report is due to be made public any day now. Hopefully will reveal a little more with the access to records that they've had. But from speaking to survivors, from speaking to women sent to these institutions, they just felt like they had no choice. You know, even if they signed an adoption paper, even if they signed that agreement, and that agreement involved, you know, promising never to search for their child, they felt like it would be a sin to ever look for their child again, to ever contact their child again. And so, you know, but they were told within these institutions, you know, you'd be selfish to keep your child. What sort of life are you going to be able to offer your child? was an economic issue as well, you know, that people saw these single mothers as a burden on the taxpayer. That was one reason that they were sent, you know, from the mother and baby institutions to the Magdalen laundry. You were called a repeat offender if you had more than one child. And it was thought that, you know, better to send them away for good to the nuns to work for free in these institutions and be, you know, then support them, than for the state to support them. The, you know, what they called the unmarried mother's allowance only came in the 1970s. So there was no economic support. These women really, you know, it was to be destitute or to live a life of extreme poverty and isolation and discrimination if you kept your child. So it was a reality that many women did have their babies even physically taken from their arms. They were not allowed hold or spend time with their children in these institutions. Some were too young to give consent. Some didn't, you know the illegal nature of the adoptions that the nuns organized, and lawyers and everyone else who was involved. And so the question of consent, you know, I don't think in that environment at that time, you know, over these many years, a woman really could consent. You know, there was just so much pressure and so much stigma, and a very subtle, you know, and strong coercion.
Yes, and I do think that enforced separation of women from their, that inflicted on the women, and also then, of course, subsequently on the children. There are parallels, of course, in our contemporary lives where we see those kinds of separations, where the notion of consent isn't really operational. Like you say, I'm thinking of border situations in the US, for example, where women are separated from their baby, and mothers and fathers separated from their children. And I also think of women who come to work in Ireland from a number of countries abroad because they can't survive financially and send money, remittances home to their children, just as so many women went to the US. But maybe we will listen to Connie Roberts' wonderful poem, Inheritance, now, and come back to some of those issues when we've heard Connie read her poem. Connie Roberts now.
Hi Ailbhe, hi Caelainn, hi Jess. I'm delighted to be a part of this special evening. Thank you so much to Rachel and the Irish Arts Centre for inviting me. And heartiest congratulations to you, Caelainn, on the publication of Republic of Shame. It is an important book. In documenting the Irish institutional story, there is room at the table for everyone. Academics, historians, human rights activists, journalists, artists of all stripes, poets, playwrights, novelists, dancers, musicians. But the head of the table should always be reserved for the survivor. They are the ones who were in the trenches, who sludged through the mud, who took the bullets. Thank you, Caelainn, for putting the survivor front and centre in Republic of Shame. I grew up in an industrial school, or orphanage as we called it back then, in the Irish Midlands. I'm one of 15 children, and all 15 of us went through the industrial school system in Ireland from the 1960s to the 1980s. I'd like to share with you a poem I wrote several years ago entitled Inheritance, in memory of the Poor Clare Orphanage Fire 1943 in Cavan Town. 35 young girls and one old woman perished in that fire. St. Joseph's Industrial School was run by the Poor Clares, an enclosed order of nuns. I was inspired to write my poem after reading the 1985 book Children of the Poor Clares by Irish journalists Mavis Arnold and Heather Lasky. Their book was based on court documents, eyewitness testimony, and newspaper clippings. In my poem, I include several quotes from those court documents. The Irish government issued a report stating that the 36 deaths were due to lack of emergency procedures and firefighting training. Testimonies of survivors and rescuers, however, suggest that the nuns shooed girls upstairs to another dormitory so that the townsmen couldn't see them in their nightshirts. Beggars belief, doesn't it? The old woman who perished, Maggie Smyth, had grown up in the institution and had returned in old age. And now, the poem. It is in 8 parts. The 8th part is a nod to a prayer that's recited after. So, all you good Catholics out there should recognize it. Inheritance. In memory of the Poor Clare Orphanage Fire, 23rd of February 1943, Cavan. It would be easy to saccharine their deaths with morning dew. God knows it could happen to a bishop or a poet. But I won't sing of winged angels and burnished gold. I won't tell it slant. Come, let the blazing truth blind. Hard of hearing, Dolly Duffy slept through Miss O'Reilly's order to rise and go into St. Clair's. Townsmen with axes battering down the front door. Mary Caffrey's clanging keys. John McNally's, get the children out, get everyone out, for God's sake, get them out. The Cassidy sisters, Mona, where are you? Over here, Josie, over here. Sister Felix's, try to put the fire out like a good lad. And the unidentified voice to the male intruders, go back down, do you hear me? Go back down. But Una Smith scrambled back up in the heat and the dark to the Sacred Heart, fingered a rosary of bed knobs till she found her. Rushing the act of contrition, Dolly placed her apron on her head like a mantilla and braved the choking smoke down the wooden stairs. The last child to exit this way, her soul's smouldering when she stumbled out onto Main Street. Maggie Smyth came home, her best years spent as a live-in skivvy for a doctor or a judge. Sure, where else would she go? The Magdalen Laundry, the county home? Hadn't St. Joseph's been home since it opened its doors over 70 years before? Yes, Maggie Smyth came home to the early morning prayers in the coffin-cold chapel and the late-night crying of babies in their cots. Not quite on equal footing with the nuns, but a rung above their charges. Shawled and shuffling up the town for bits and bobs, a bar of sunlight soap or a jar of Bovril, Maggie Smyth came home to die. Ashen-faced, the aged woman hobbled into St. Clair's. As an older girl led the younger ones in a decade of the rosary, Maggie lay down on an empty bed, a pyre of striped ticking, and waited. The lights went dead. Screams now pierced the choking blackness. Get us out! We're smothering! Sisters called to one another. Others crawled on their bellies to the high windows. Sooty faces pressed against window panes. A girl on her knees coughed out prayers, and the polished floor buckled, wardrobes and cots demolished by famished flames. Timbers crashed, glass smashed 40 feet to the street below. 5 little forms huddled against the dormitory door. Myth be damned at the sight of the clothes burning on the back of 4-year-old Lizzie Heafy from Swords. What can be said? The Keystone Brigade bungled attempts at rescue. Hoses leaked, ladders couldn't reach, and the sort of but not really captain said it took 45 minutes to assemble a crew, 5 minutes more than it took the fire to swallow 35 children and 1 old woman. Tell me, how does that add up? But that pre-Lenten night, Cavan, like any Irish town, had its blessings too. Men beckoned children on hot windowsills to jump into their outstretched arms. Veronica took a leap of faith. Maureen slipped through one man's embrace, breaking her legs. Another fell on a lean-to shed. An ESB ladder was procured and hoisted. A GAA man and a doctor risked life and limb to reach the smoke-billowing windows before the heavens came crashing down. 36 bodies, 8 coffins, Colley's graveyard, no memorial. Children of the poor Clares, pray for us. The 13 Marys, have mercy on us. Mary Barrett, Mary Brady, Mary Carroll, Mary Galligan, Mary Harrison, Mary Hughes, Mary Ivers, Mary Kelly, Mary Lowry, Mary Lynch, Mary Roach, Mary O'Hara, Mary McKiernan. Children of the church, children most pure, children most vulnerable. Kathleen Chambers, Kathleen Kiley, Kathleen Riley. Josephine Carroll, Josephine Cassidy, Mona Cassidy. Ellen Morgan, Ellen Payne, Harriet Payne. Nora Barrett, Margaret Chambers, Dorothy Daly. Frances Kiley, Bridget Galligan, Susan McKiernan. Elizabeth Heafy, Ellen McHugh, Philomena Regan. Bernadette Serridge, Margaret Lynch, Teresa White, Rose Wright. Pray for us, O children of God. Pray that our indifference will not be our inheritance. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the evening.
It's a very powerful and compelling poem. Thank you so much, Connie. And I know, Caelainn, that you are going to follow that reading by Connie with a very short reading from Republic of Shame. Will you put it in context for us?
I will, and that poem by Connie is just so powerful. And I think what she talks about, being aware of the indifference to the institutionalization of vulnerable people today, the forced separations of children from their parents at the border, like you were saying, the rollback of reproductive rights in the US. And, I think it's so important to think about what we, can learn from how this system was normalized. And I learned so much writing this book. And the very short piece that I'm going to read now is from the chapter, You Don't Know What You're Going to Find. And it's a chapter that is focused on the stories of people my own age, from my generation, who are only beginning to search for answers. And many are spending years on wait lists to begin to gain access to information or to start the process of tracing their parents. In Ireland, people adopted in this country still don't have the right to their birth information. So there's still a culture of secrecy being perpetuated. And I think this section just shows how close to home this was for me. A woman I know told me something over coffee one day that she'd never previously mentioned. Her mother was born in one of the mother and baby homes, and the father was a priest. She described attending the priest's funeral with an archbishop present. She told anyone who asked that she was the priest's grandchild. Both around 30. Neither of us had children yet. She said, "I'm not getting broody or anything, but I can't imagine what it would be like to have my baby taken away." She joked about how, if it had been us, we would have fought off the nuns to keep our kids. But I doubted that. The women sent to the institutions were told they were shameful, that they couldn't provide the future a child deserved. A married couple could give their child everything. The conversation was an example, one of many for me, of a strange paradox. It was hard for me sometimes to imagine myself into the not-so-distant past of the mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries. And yet, many people of my generation were still living with the legacy of the institutions.
Well, thank you very much, Caelainn. That's a very thoughtful, self-reflexive piece. I still can't imagine what it must have been like actually doing all of this work, this writing, the interviewing, the research on such an incredibly difficult a topic, and seeing those connections that are still there in a way in our world today. Just really, I found that piece there very, very moving, because I think we can be very quick to blame people by imposing on them the kinds of assumptions that we make in our contemporary lives, and not understanding the difference of the historical context. And you actually restored that for us. Not that I think anyone would ever have blamed, or that we would ever blame any of those forsaken women. They weren't fallen, they were forsaken by us all, I suppose. I'd like to invite Jess Cavner to join us now. And if Jess is going to come on screen. Hello, Jess. You're very welcome.
Hi.
Jess is, well, as Rachel introduced you, a musician, a poet, a performer, and also another woman of Dublin town.
Absolutely, yeah, very much a Dub. North side, born and bred. Now moved to Dublin 8. Very cool area, if you know.
Absolutely. Well, I actually wanted to ask the two of you. I don't know who set off with it, but how you met, because you had an extraordinary encounter, or really that led to something extraordinary. So how did you meet?
I had read about Jess's.
I thought Jess was about to start.
Go first.
Let me start, because I think it makes more sense. I was familiar with Jess's music and her activism as well. During the repeal referendum, Jess appeared on the cover of Hot Press magazine, and spoke about the reproductive rights and her own experience and her family's, and how women in her family had been affected by the culture of shame in Ireland, by the way that women were stigmatized, and the way reproductive freedoms were taken away from women. And so I think I reached out, I can't remember how, and we met in Dublin, and I remember being really moved by the way Jess talked about finding, I think you called it, a linguistic arsenal of how to talk about this legacy. And, really thinking very deeply about how it has affected people across generations, and what it means to be a generational survivor of these homes, of these institutions. And also the discrimination against people within the institutions and how that has affected communities in Ireland. And so, you know, I knew from speaking with survivors that, you know, children who had disabilities were often sent to reject wards, you know, and deemed unadoptable by the nuns. And it was the same for mixed race children, mixed race Irish children. And so Jess had just, you know, really thought about the impact of this on our generation. I think we had a shared experience of growing up in an Ireland that was changing. And also we were both, I guess, so-called illegitimate children. Jess was born, the law changed in Ireland in 1987. So I was born just after illegitimacy was abolished in Ireland, and Jess was born just before. So we're of the same generation, but you know, that is how long that stigma, you know, was perpetuated in law in this country.
And Jess, to be a generational survivor, you tell us a bit about it. How did that feel when you were, not that you're very old now, but I mean, when you were growing up, when you were young, when you were coming into being a girl and then a young woman?
Yeah, I mean, for me, you know, one of the things that is very different in regards to generational methods of survival and processing trauma, you know, exactly what Caelainn was talking about was the term of linguistic arsenal that I came up with kind of making sense of your narrative and the words that you would have to process the trauma. And you know, there were words that my parents, my mother, my aunties and uncles didn't have. Certainly there was no words like you know, like mixed race, or there wasn't words like even trauma or emotional processing or generational trauma. You know, you were told to kind of get on with things, and there was no discussion about it in the home. You know, even though it was very obvious that my mother was a Black woman and my aunties and uncles were people of color and my grandparents were white, you know, despite that, we never talked about it. And I remember being very young, and I remember telling Caelainn this, you know, my nana used to bring me to mass, and I actually really enjoyed it because I really enjoyed the silence. I enjoyed getting out of the house. So it was time with my nana, and I used to get Milky Bar buttons afterwards. So it was an excellent time for me as a 4-year-old. And I remember being in the back of the car and kind of very proudly saying, because I knew a fact, and being like, Nana, Mommy told me that she was adopted. And I remember my Nana kind of swinging around into the back, and just kind of that feeling of like, I'm not in trouble, though I'm usually in trouble, but Nana's angry. And she kind of said something along the lines of, why did she tell you that? That's not true. She was adopted from birth. And that's different. That's not the same. It's not the same. And of course, I didn't know, you know, the nuances of what that meant. And, you know, it was only, you know, Caelainn informing me that there was that kind of attempt to take away the stigma by talking about the fact that you were adopted from birth, so that you were never kind of somebody who spent a lot of time within the institutions or within those orphanages, and so it was something different or whatever. And so that was my first ever experience of trying to talk to my family about it when I was super young. And you know, as I got older, it was difficult. You know, I was a stereotypical teenager. I had my own issues as well from on my father's side. My father wasn't really around. I was one of the illegitimate children with the dash on my birth cert, where my father's name should have been. And so, you know, it really only got to my late teens when I started to feel comfortable talking to my mother about her heritage and her background. And it was still something that she found difficult to talk about. And then unfortunately then she passed away. She passed away when she was about to turn 51, just before I was about to turn 30 or 21. And now, I mean, I still have my aunt, and I still have my uncle and my other auntie. They do talk about it, but you know, when you ask them about, you know, how do you feel about being mixed race, or you know, bring that up, you know, a lot of the time it's just like, well, I'm Irish, and that's how they see it, and it's not. I don't feel comfortable kind of, you know, poking that bear. You know, if that's how they perceive their identity, and that's how, you know, they've developed it for, you know, the guts of 50 to 60 or, you know, 50 years or so. That's their experience, you know.
Yes. Well, I mean, not quite not at all in the same way as you do, but I grew up, I was part of that generation where everything was pushed under the carpet. And if you attempted to name anything, people fled. I mean, like snow of a ditch, they melted into the background. I still have her actually, an illegitimate daughter, and had to fight very hard to sort of get rid of that illegitimacy status, which I managed to do actually for payments from the civil service. However, that's a story for another day. But I'm just thinking that over the generations, there have been so many, the legacy of all of that is almost sort of washing its way through flowing through repeated generations and hopefully getting weaker. So just a quick question for each of you, and I mean quick because we don't want to run out of time. We want to hear Jess reading. Are you hopeful for the future in Ireland? And dare I ask it, even globally, but particularly just in Ireland? Well, we start with Caelainn.
I think in Ireland, yes. I think that we have gone through in recent years radical change where people, like I said, are trusting each other, are, opening up about their experiences, are breaking silences about what happened in these institutions. But, there's still a huge amount to be done to really face up to this legacy. There are mothers who are still searching for where their children are buried, who died in these institutions. Thousands of children died in these mother and baby institutions, and we don't know where thousands of them are buried. And that is just an unimaginable pain. And those mothers as families deserve answers. There is still, barriers to accessing birth information, accessing records. We are expecting this final report, but, that access to information, and Jess can speak to this, the denial of that the state holds many of these records that were held by the religious agencies, and survivors say that the state is actually redacting more information than the nuns ever did. So there is still a culture of secrecy, within the system, within the institutional system. And then we risk repeating that system. We look at direct provision, which is a institutional system for people seeking international protection. We look at the US as well with the forced separations, but also I think that influence of religious agencies, of anti-abortion, crisis pregnancy agencies that are seeking to roll back reproductive rights, in the name of religious freedom. And, the institution that I mentioned that remained open in Ireland until 2006, women were sent to that through, religious crisis pregnancy agencies. And so I think, internationally, these sort of systems of separation, these institutional systems that separate women from their children are ongoing, and that really needs to change. And I think there's still a lot of stigma against single mothers too, single parents, homeless mothers, and who often end up separated by the state and institutionalized. So I won't go on, but I think hopeful, but we need to remain vigilant and to realize that a lot still needs to change. And I think we need to listen to survivors.
Yes, definitely. Jess, what about you? It'll have to be brief. Anything?
I guess from my perspective, I can think about the micro. I can think about the fact that, we are now the generation who have had parents who were traumatized, who were not given any therapy, and the kind of relationships that we had with our parents as a result of that. And then the relationship my parents had with their grandparents, who were also traumatized, who ended up being sent to mother and baby homes. And so we now kind of have the obligation, I guess. I want to say obligation instead of burden, but like the obligation of being the alchemists. We have to kind of turn that energy into something that's beautiful, into something that's galvanizing, into something that is as a fuel for social change. And I think that we are more than capable of doing that. But it's a lot, because it's about healing yourself from the inside. It's about beginning with your own self-healing, and then it's also then kind of, you know, branching that out into community, and into community healing, and then hopefully international healing. And so it's super doable. But maintaining these conversations, having these discussions, having different generations like we're having here to talk about it, is exactly what we want to do.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And we would love to hear some of your alchemy now, if you would like to to read to us. Girl in Blue.
It would be my pleasure. And let me just get ready here. So this is my poem. This is a poem that I wrote for the launch of Republic of Shame in Hodges and Figgis in Dublin. And this is a poem about making sense, I guess, of my own personal narrative, my family narrative, and then maybe on a wider perspective, community and national narrative. And this is called 4 Girls in Blue. 4 girls in blue faced 4 girls more, and they shifted their shoes on a parquet floor. We ditched our classes, a laborious tomb, to think of our future in assembly room. 2 girls spoke of hostels, where you go hang with boys. 2 spoke of old women, left with old toys. Now, I wanted the fields where I get up to no good, not a place with the elms, where High Park stood. The girls said it's basically like hanging out with your friends. The old women are confused and they think they're young again. If you bring them your makeup, your magazines and games, they think they're like you. They think they're the same. Now, I was cursed with the youth. And my family were crippled with young deaths around me. I knew no elderly people. When I was 15, I thought maybe it's normal to believe you're a teenager. It's elderly turmoil. But it haunted me. And the story hung on from 15 to 33, a story 18 years strong. You see, I believe we are cells, a network of ancestral info, and the story hit the bank of my brain and didn't let go. Like stories of my nana, working as a cook in a laundry where she smuggled in booze and cigarettes and maybe money. My nana who would stand up to a nun's violent throttle. She kept saying Bernadette's halo on a blue water bottle. She ran away from home before her church bells sang to the Isle of Man with a motorbike gang. And her sister Kay moved to England so she'd be a nurse and dated a black man. To our family, she was cursed. But a child of wanted, a child out of wedlock, she'd be sent to the country, developmental deadlock. And even now, I have nightmares of being abandoned alone in some woods, this pain transcended. And when I was 13, I found my mother's birth cert. I read out my grandmother's name and my mom's voice. Kurt said, Jess, have a fucking think for a second. What is Kathleen short for? Think of a nickname. What are you staring at me for? Kathy? Maybe I was a little ashamed that I wasn't smart as my mammy and sensitive to blame. She shouted, K, Jess. Auntie K is what's written. Why do you think she loved you? She was smitten. So you see, motorbike granny, my Nana Betty, went behind her family's back and adopted her sister's baby. Then her and her husband, fearing my mom would feel left out, adopted 3 other mixed race kids in 1960s Beaumont. Liz, Susan, Dermot Jr. and Anna, I still have all 3, but not my mother. But fuck me, you should be there. When the cousins scattered in a fire get drunk together, all beige and ambiguous, and we wonder what the fuck we are. Padre Pio and rosaries and 4 black children. Malevolence, generosity wielded the DNA of my family. Tragedy and circumstance, survivor mode, a state of mind, and unshook permanence. Inherited anxiety, inherited rage, inherited rebellion, inherited wisdom and sage, inherited connection to the women left behind in High Park with survivor skin and a teenage mind. To a system against them, to a system we are told that's finished, irrelevant, but we know unresolved, to the most powerful man in our state, unable to spit an apology to families unstable. to the girls in blue, to the women in black, to the women who still wake up feeling attacked, know your sisters are close and will hold you while you sleep. That the known and the unknown, the memories we keep. We will always hold you. We will hold your space for healing and love, for peace and grace. And when those parquet floors are gone, I will sing our song. In my DNA, I know something went wrong. And that will always drive me to do what's right. To the white, black, brown, and blue girls, we have been born to fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. That is such a powerful poem. And I'm thinking yourself and Connie writing so differently, but both so very powerfully, also across generations, which I think is really, really, really interesting. We certainly got a lot of ancestral info this evening. I'm thinking I love that phrase, ancestral info. And I think it's been a very, I have certainly found it a very enriching evening, and it's just been lovely to talk with you, Caelainn, and to hear Connie, and then to talk with and hear you too, Jess. I'm sort of slightly taking an executive decision. We don't really have time to pay proper respect to the questions. But I also do want to say that I know that there are survivors who have been listening and watching the live stream this evening. And indeed, Caelainn, I think that perhaps someone whose story is actually included in the book. And I just want to say that I hope for each of you who is listening that you have found just a little comfort in the warm arms that we would put around you now. And Caelainn, I wonder if you wanted just to make a closing comment, given that there are survivors here this evening.
There are, and I know one of them. I think Carl is listening in, and he was adopted from Ireland's biggest mother and baby home, and he has searched for answers for a very long time. And we actually went together to the nuns to try and get more answers. He was, searched for very long to get answers from the state. And I think I would, I think it's important for many people in the US who might have gone through this system to remember that there are many generational survivors living in the United States. People who were sent as children, as babies from Ireland, from these institutions, separated from their families, and who are still looking for answers. And I think, what we can do to support survivors is to make sure that they have the right to their information, to the records that are held on them by the state and by the church, and that when they seek answers, if they choose to, that they have the right to that truth, and that their rights are respected. So, I think that there's been such a burden on survivors to speak about their experiences and to be the catalyst for change, that we need to do that as well. We need to stand up and make sure that those changes happen. And I'm just very grateful to everyone who spoke to me for this book. And, I hope that it helps people understand something of what survivors have gone through and their experiences within this system. And like many survivors said to me, they spoke about their experiences, their trauma, so that things would change, so that this would not happen again, and so that people would respect that right to information. So I'm just very grateful to be here with you both today and, to share these insights.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Caelainn. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Connie. And thank you to everybody who has been listening and watching. And I will say good night to you and pass you back to Rachel Gilkey.
And I offer my thanks as well. Thank you to Connie and Jess for sharing your work with us tonight. Thank you, Ailbhe, for your leadership overseeing this conversation tonight. And of course, Caelainn, thank you for the work that you've done. This conversation will be posted at irishartcenter.org. You can also find links at irishartcenter.org on this event page or in the comments for Republic of Shame, as well as for both Jess and Connie's work. I would encourage you to pick this book up if you have not already and join in bearing witness to these stories, because that's how we can honor these experiences. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I think that was so powerfully